Welcome back to The Lost Legends. I'm Adam Jones, and I'm going to tell you stories you've never heard and probably won't believe. Today we're going to study 3 more stories about vampires from our friend William of Newburgh. We're going to learn the best way to kill a vampire in the Middle Ages, and I'm going to tell you just a little bit about why I think these stories are actually important. I get the impression when I read these that William of Newburgh does not want to talk about vampires. He says that he gets so many stories about vampires that he doesn't have time to write them all down. It would be an unbelievable undertaking, he says, to write all of them down, but these stories keep pouring in anyway. But he tells a few. He picks stories that are recent. He also picks stories that come from educated people that he can trust. And then he stops the vampires and wants to go back to normal history. I'll talk about that some later, but I find his attitude toward these stories to be very interesting. We're going to begin with the story of the dog priest. That might sound charming, but it's not. Calling someone a dog in the Middle Ages was a pretty bad insult, and the reason for that is because dogs back then were usually seen as these pack animals that roamed wild. They were usually diseased. They were usually scavengers. Dogs in the Middle Ages were not adorable pets. Now, there were pets, there were domesticated animals, but usually when people talked about dogs, they were talking about the dogs that live outside of town. They breed into packs, and when they come into town, they carry diseases. They're usually very dirty, and they're usually causing trouble. So calling someone a dog back then was not a good thing. And the dog priest was called the dog priest when he was alive, not as a vampire, but during his time. So this priest was very unpopular, and I think it's interesting that William points that out. Our historian points out this guy was not well liked, and we're going to see this as a theme, that some of these vampires were already unpopular before they died, but it also shows us something very interesting about life in the Middle Ages. I'll get to that later. When he died, he was placed in a tomb. We don't have a lot of information about the tomb exactly, but in general, a tomb is a place that's not easy to get in and out of. You don't open it up casually. So being placed in a tomb usually means you're not getting out. Of course, you don't get placed in a tomb usually unless you're dead. But this guy did get out. The dog priest was heard running around the halls yelling and scaring people. This was reported, of all things, by a woman who lived in the monastery. And you might already be wondering, why is a woman living in a monastery? And the truth is, monasteries are interesting places. In the Middle Ages, the monastery wasn't always just a group of men walking around in circles and saying prayers. Monasteries fulfilled unique needs, especially in England. In this case, a woman happened to live in the monastery, and we find out that she's a very wealthy woman. She appealed to the friars who were part of that monastery and said, "This guy is coming out at night and bothering me and scaring me. You have to do something about it." And she specifically said, "I want you men to say prayers for me, a lot of extra prayers, because I donate so much money to your monastery. You should pray for me." That is a very interesting detail, I think. This is not just some person that happens to have a lot of money, but someone who thinks she has the local church in her pocket. I'm sure the local friars did say their prayers for her, but one of them also picked up an axe and waited all night for that vampire. This is clearly someone who should have a movie made after him. He waits almost all night, and just when he's ready to give up, the vampire shows up, screaming and yelling, trying to scare the friar away. But the friar wasn't afraid. He picked up his axe, and he hit the vampire right in the chest. The vampire bled everywhere, turned around and ran. And the friar taunted him, said, "Go on back to your tomb." And he did. And the friar watched the tomb open. Now you may be wondering, what kind of tomb is this? Is it one of those old stone caskets with a heavy lid? Is it a set of doors? And we're not really told. But whatever it is, it opened up all by itself, let the vampire in, and then closed. Now, we see these vampires sometimes do things during the day, but they tend to be more confident at night. That's also part of Bram Stoker's Dracula. He could be out in the day in full sunlight. He just was more confident and maybe more powerful at night. It's not entirely clear. These vampires tended to sleep all day, so the next morning, the friar got 3 other men, and the 4 of them opened up the tomb. And inside they found the vampire, the dog priest. He had a huge wound on his chest right where the friar said he'd hit him. And as usually happens in old vampire stories, they decided, let's set the body on fire. That'll solve our problem, and it did. Now, a little note about that. Why are we setting them on fire? This happens in vampire stories. Fire tends to hurt vampires. It's more common for a vampire to be killed with a stake through the heart, right? But decapitation and fire are also common ways to kill one. In the old days, that's how they almost always died. And remember, other people were burned alive by the church. Heretics. They were burned alive because it was a symbol. They were burning away the impurity of their heresy. The famous Bible translator John Wycliffe, he died in 1384, 40 years after his death. Part of the church decided that he was a heretic. They dug up his body and burned his bones, even though he was already dead. That's what it meant to the medieval person when you said you set someone on fire, as you were talking about a heretic who needed to have their impurities burned out of the world. So setting vampires on fire is not just a very fun and dramatic ending to your story. It actually was a symbolic end and has something of a theological notion to it. Next we have a Scottish vampire. His story is much like a lot of these stories. He's a very wealthy man. Nobody liked him. He was some kind of a crook. We don't know much about him before he died, except that he was wealthy, and he was not a good person. And he wasn't the kind of lovable rogue. He was the kind of crooked man that everybody hated. So when he died, we assume nobody shed much of a tear, but as you can imagine, he didn't stay dead. And he was seen at night running around with a pack of dogs. Now we're back to dogs again. Dogs show up in many old vampire stories. I don't know why, but they're always there. And something else accompanies this vampire besides dogs. Pestilence. A plague. Now the story tells us that this man, this vampire from Scotland, would walk around all night with a pack of dogs, making him very dangerous. And he would scare people, and nobody would go out at night. And many people in town were dead by this plague, and no one could figure out what to do about it. They were watching their town be destroyed, one person at a time, and they were afraid to go out at night. Now, how do you deal with them? Well, for one thing, everybody kind of knew how to deal with a vampire. Now, let me issue an apology. I told you last time that I was telling you the first vampire stories of England. I'm obviously not, because by the time these stories come out, people already know what to do. They already know how to deal with a vampire. So what I'm actually giving you is some of the first recorded vampire stories. By the time we get to the 12th century here, everyone is familiar with the vampire story. And they all knew what to do. Set him on fire. But this one's kind of interesting. I don't know what to make of this, but I kind of like to point out that this Scottish vampire would tell people how to kill him. He would say to them, "This disease will destroy your town, and I will haunt your town until you set my body on fire." He's probably the only villain in a vampire story to explain to people how to kill him. We can't tell if he was doing that to be helpful, or if he was taunting people, but the town understood what he was saying, dug up his body in the middle of the day, and set it on fire. And that not only stopped the vampire, but also the disease. This is a very common trajectory of the medieval vampire story. Rich person is dead, they come back with a pack of dogs, they spread disease, they're killed by being set on fire, and that ends the plague. Our final story is the Vampire of Castle Anantis. This one was very recent to William of Newburgh. In fact, a priest who had been there came straight to William to tell him about it. This story starts off in a familiar way. There's a wicked man who lives in a castle. He has a long reputation of being a bad person, of being a criminal, and apparently nobody in town liked him one bit. That included his wife. You see, the manner in which he died involved his wife. The rich, crooked man thought that his wife was cheating on him. So one day he pretended to leave, and then he snuck back in and caught his wife with somebody else. I'm not sure how the rich man thought this was going to go. Did he plan to confront this man? Did he plan to confront his wife? We're not really sure, because as soon as he saw his wife with another man, he passed out. After he passed out, the rich man spent a few days being very sick, being very injured from passing out. A local priest, the same one that told the story later to William of Newburgh, the priest told him, "You're not doing well, you need to get right with God." But the rich man didn't want to do that. He spent his time being angry, and then he did die of his injuries. We're told that he received a Christian burial. Amusingly, we're told he didn't deserve it, because William of Newburgh is a very opinionated historian. And then we're told that the burial didn't work very well because he came back. This man is referred to as the Hellhound of Castle Anantis. Again, calling people dogs is a pretty big insult in the Middle Ages. It does remind me of Dracula, because Dracula was seen with dogs or as a dog from time to time. Anything that spread disease you would associate with a vampire, and once again, a disease does show up in this town. If you've read Bram Stoker's Dracula, or watched the similar film Nosferatu, you're familiar with this. When Dracula comes to town, a plague comes to town. The idea of a plague following a vampire around has been left out of today's vampire stories, but it was absolutely essential to the old ones. This vampire was stopped when two brothers who lost their father to the plague decided to do something about it. They took shovels and they started digging, and they found two surprising things. They found three surprising things. The first is that the body was too close to the surface, not nearly as deep as they dug it. The second is that the cloth wrapped around him had been cut in places. It was ragged. And this actually sounds more like a classic mummy story right now. But the third is the most interesting. The body was too big. It was bloated. It was corpulent. It was bloated with blood. They stabbed the body with a shovel and blood poured out. Extra blood. What's also interesting is that no one bothers to tell us what that means. The story doesn't seem to give any indication as to why there's extra blood in his body. It's just there. This is before any vampires ever sucked blood or asked for blood, but here it is as an important part of the story. The two brothers said, let's take this guy out of town, but instead of just setting him on fire, we're going to cut him up and even pull his heart out. Now, one more note, dismemberment. I told you that setting somebody on fire was a symbolic act, something you do with heretics. But you know, dismembering, cutting a person up, that also is a symbolic act. If you were a traitor to the English crown, you might have your body cut up into little pieces, or maybe each part of your body would be cut. Your arms and legs might be hung from different trees in different places. Dismemberment was the king's way of dealing with a traitor. So when we see a vampire in the Middle Ages, we either set them on fire like they're a heretic, cut them up like they're a traitor to the crown, or we do both. Maybe vampires are just the worst of both worlds, traitors and heretics all in one. When we're finished with the story of the Hellhound of Anantis Castle, William says that he wants to get back to regular history. Now that to me is absolutely fascinating. Regular history. He makes some little apologies along the way. He doesn't really want to tell these stories, like I told you. I think he really doesn't think they're true, and he thinks it's a waste of his time. He wants to go and tell the great historical moments. I mean, he's our big source for King John, part of an English Civil War. He's our source from some other important people. He does great history, and he wants to get back to it. He doesn't think these stories are important. And a lot of modern historians also don't think these stories are important. But I do. I think these stories have great value, and let me explain why. There are some important common threads in these stories. I already pointed out corruption. We met a woman in the first story who wanted the church to pray for her because she was such a big donor. That's an interesting thing to do, to think you own a religious institution because of donations. And our other two stories are about rich people who were abusing their power. So we have people, ordinary common people, who are dealing with corruption. They're also dealing with a disease, with a plague, dare I say a pandemic. And sometimes their responses to these pandemics are not logical. Suddenly, these people in the past don't seem that different from the rest of us. In fact, their struggles are relatable. Remember who was king at the time? King John. King John was the reason we wrote the Magna Carta. I mentioned that last time. He was so corrupt that the English nobility decided to write a new document trying to keep future kings from being so corrupt. So corrupt rulers, a plague destroying the land, people watching their loved ones die. This is what's going on in England. And it's wonderful to study the kings and queens, the important battles, the so-called important moments of history. But it's also great to have a moment to look at normal people, because the struggles of ordinary people are usually left out of the pages of history. Thanks for listening. Next week I'm going to talk about something that's not historical at all, but I think you're going to love it. So join me next time at The Lost Legends. This is Adam Jones.